We're going to begin today's unique feature video by doing the back of the aircraft near the exhaust. Anytime I start a new kit, I always like to start with the formers. If a glue gun is sat around, it can become clogged up. By doing the formers first, this will give the glue gun a chance to get unclogged. Once it's all warmed up, the glue will come out much more evenly, which will make adding skins and other critical areas much cleaner. You can see here I've already done the formers. A couple things I want to point out. If you look at the F9, F10 former, you'll see that we've got foam here and foam here with wood sandwiched in the middle. When gluing the wood together, you can use hot glue, you can use wood glue, or you can use CA. It doesn't really matter. In addition to the formers, we're going to be putting together a bunch of stringers. This is the first kit where we've used stringers. When doing a stringer, you can look for this symbol right here. This is the book fold symbol. This is a new symbol, and I'm going to show you real quickly how that works. Anytime you see this book fold symbol, you can take the back side of a razor blade, run it down the score, and you're simply going to fold the part back over on itself. Once that's done, I'm going to add a bead of glue, fold it over, and hold it for about 30 seconds. Go ahead and do that on all the stringers included with the kit. You'll also notice a long stringer included with your kit. It's going to be easy to identify because it's got these two arrows. We'll let that cool down for a few seconds, then we're going to test fit it on our F6, F7 former. To test fit our stringer, we're going to drop the tail end into the notch in this former. You'll see that the back edge is flush with the F6 former. If we look up towards the front, you'll notice the arrow is pointed away from the former. Once our test fit looks good, we're going to add some glue to the former and drop the stringer in place. Let's hold that for about a minute and a half while the glue cools, then we're going to add our next former. Once the glue's had a chance to cool down, we're going to drop our F5 former in place. Look for these two reference marks right here in the middle of our stringer. What we're going to do is we're going to drop this former in place. I'm going to roll this over, and I want to make sure that that reference mark is centered front to back. Once we've done our test fit, let's apply some glue to the former. And drop the stringer back down into the notch. Let's let that cool for a minute and a half before moving on. Once that's had a chance to cool down, go ahead and grab your C10B skin located in your kit. Let's go ahead and remove all the paper from the side with the symbol mapping. Once we've got all the paper removed, using the back side of my razor blade, I'm going to go down two of the scores. We're not going to go down the center score. We're going to go down the score on the right and the left of the center line. Once you've gone down, go ahead and break it open. Even with the paper removed, the symbol mapping will still be visible. Here at the back, we see that this is going to go onto the F6 former, and it's going to be a flush fit. So we're going to go right up to the edge of the F6 former. Up here at the front, we're going to be attaching this to the F5 former. Since it doesn't say flush fit, we're going to have a little bit of foam sticking out. We do have one more set of instructions that are very important. This says 6 o'clock. This tells us that this is going to be on the bottom side of the aircraft. Now let's talk about adding some shape. If you look at the underside of our skin, you're going to see a whole bunch of scores. These scores have been included to really help us nail down the shape throughout the entire aircraft build. If you notice, I don't have a mat on my table. Normally when I'm adding shape, I want to go over a very hard 90-degree edge. But since I have these scores in place, you'll notice that the edge of my table is more rounded. What I'm going to do is I'm simply going to add a little bit of shape over the areas where the scores are present. If you've done other models that don't have scores, you're quickly going to notice that it takes a lot less work to add shape in the areas where scores are present. One thing I'd like to point out, you'll see this area with a bunch of scores, and you can see as we go out towards the edges that there's less scores. So when I'm adding some shape, most of my time is spent on the area with the most scores. The areas with just a few scores, I'll just add just a little bit of shape. Now let's do a test fit. Once your C10B skin has been glued in place, you can flip your whole assembly over. You'll also notice that I put down a piece of foam. I put this down to help protect the skin. We're going to be flipping this aircraft over again and again and again, and having something that's a little bit softer than the tabletop is really going to go a long way to keep your model from getting dented up as you do your build. You can use newspaper, you can use cardboard. I do prefer foam board if you have some extra. Next, we're going to start rolling this skin around. And you'll see here at the back that it's pretty round, and you can see up here at the front that it's pretty flat. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be just gluing this a little bit at a time. We're also going to be adding our stringers. These stringers are really going to help hold the complex shape of the F-4 Phantom aircraft. So you can see that these stringers are going to drop right inside these notches on the formers. So if you look up here at the front, you'll see that I've got the stringer only going about halfway through the stack of 3 formers. We want to make sure that we have plenty of bite whenever we're adding our stringer going from the F5 former forward. Once everything's glued in place, we will be trimming the excess here at the rear. Now that we've got a game plan, let's start gluing. Let's begin our process by gluing our first stringer in place. I'm going to add glue to one end of the stringer and attach it to the notch in the F5 former. Again, I'm making sure that I'm only going halfway through the stack. I'm going to hold that in place while the glue cools, and then we're going to start gluing the skin in place. If you remember, the back of our C10B skin has the flush fit instructions. So as we attach the skin to the former, we're going to make sure that the edge of the skin is flush with the former. What we're going to do is we're going to add a bead of glue from here all the way down to where the skin is hinged. Next, I'm going to press it closed, and I need to make a small adjustment. I'm having to push my former slightly forward so that it remains flush to the edge of the skin. I'm going to hold this in place while the glue cools before moving on. Next, we're going to glue the C10B skin to the F5 former. Now, when I bring my skin to the edge of the foam, I may need to lift it up, I may need to push it down. What I'm looking for is I want to make sure that there is an even amount of foam sticking out all the way around. Add a little bit of glue to the former and push my skin up to the former. I'm looking to make sure that the foam above the skin looks even. That looks good, so I'm going to hold this in place for a full 2 minutes. Once the skin has been glued to both of the formers, we're going to add some glue between the skin and the stringer. You can see that I've got a little bit of a gap here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate my assembly to where I'm pushing straight down on the stringer. Next, I'm going to add a bead of glue. I'm going to shoot it up underneath that stringer. Rotate and push straight down. Give that a full 2 minutes to cool before moving on. Once that's cooled down, I'm going to add a bead of glue where the stringer meets the former. And I'm going to push straight down while the glue cools. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we're going to add our next stringer. add glue here on one end or the other to 3 sides, and we're going to drop it into the F5 former, just like we did before. If you've got some excess glue, you can always wipe it away with a little bit of scrap. Once our stringer's in place, let's go ahead and wrap the skin around this F6 former up to this stringer. I need to pull my former out just a little bit so it's flush to the edge. That looks really good. Add a bead of glue, and I'll go up to that stringer. Gently wrap my skin, and I'm going to pinch and hold it for a full 2.5 minutes. Now that we've done our test fit, I'm going to add a bead of glue to the former. I'm going to add glue along the former. I'm going to stop before I reach the stringer. Once that's done, I fold the skin over, making sure it stays flush with the edge of the former. Once the glue's had a chance to cool down, we're going to continue to wrap this skin around the F5 former. Just like before, the former may need to be pitched slightly forward or slightly back to keep it as even as possible all the way around. I'm going to add glue onto my former, and I'm going to add glue up there on the stringer. I'm going to hold that in place while the glue cools. Make sure and give that a full 2.5 minutes before letting go. Once the skin's been secured to the F5 former, go ahead and run a bead of glue up underneath the stringer. And just like before, we're going to rotate the assembly until you can push straight down on the stringer. Hold that in place for a full 2.5 minutes. Then you can glue the other end of the stringer to the F6 former. On this final former, we're going to fit it into the back like so. Here at the front, we're going to push it into the notch, and I'm going to draw a line where I need to cut it off. You'll see that I'm making a line right in the middle of the stack of 3 formers. I'll pull it out, trim off the excess, and we're going to drop it back in place. That looks really good. This time, we're going to add glue to the other end. I put glue on 3 sides and a little bit of glue on the very end, and I'm going to drop it into the open spot. Once that's glued in place, we're going to glue the remaining skin in place. I'm going to hold the skin in place. While the glue's cooling, I'm going to gently press the skin in place, looking to make sure that I've got an even amount of foam sticking out past the skin. On this next step, I'm going to be gluing the skin to the stringer before I glue the skin to the former. I'm going to add a bead of glue to the stringer, and I'm going to rotate the assembly to where I can push straight down. I'm going to hold this in place till the glue cools, then we'll glue the skin to the former. Once the stringer has been glued to the skin, we're going to glue the skin to the former. When I bring the skin to the former, I want to make sure that there's an even amount of foam sticking out past the skin. Add a little glue in the cutout, add a bead of glue underneath the skin, and I'm going to gently press it closed. You might have to pull the former forward. You may have to push it back slightly. While the glue's cooling, make sure and look at it from the side to make sure that the former is evenly sticking out past the skin. Repeat the process on the other side. Once your assembly is complete, you can use a razor blade and you can trim off all the excess stringers that are hanging out. Once that's done, using a razor blade, you can play connect the dots, and we can create the openings for our thrust tubes. To install the Edf assembly, we're going to simply push straight in. You'll notice that the wires will pass through the notch at the top of the cutout on the formers. Once it's in, I'm going to rotate it slightly so I've got good access to the wires, and we're going to hook up our ESC. At this time, go ahead and double check the prop direction. It is very difficult to change prop direction after the aircraft is assembled. Even if your EDF and ESC are color-coded, it's always a good idea to check to make sure the direction is correct. Once I've confirmed prop direction, I'm going to take and rotate the entire assembly until the wires are pointing almost straight down. The reason I'm doing this is that in the event that we have a problem with the motor, it is possible to go in through the bottom of the aircraft and access the EDF. It is very difficult if the wires are pointing upwards. Once I've got my wires rotated correctly, I'm going to run a bead of glue along the bottom of the EDF assembly where it meets the former. It doesn't take much to hold it in place. The reason I'm only adding it to the bottom is if I need to remove this assembly, it's a lot easier to cut through the glue right here. It's very difficult to access the glue if it's up here at the top. Once the glue's had a chance to cool, do the same thing on the other side. Once your EDF assemblies are glued in place, you can take your wires, bundle them up, and just drop them inside for the time being. Now we're going to add our next skin. Before we get started, let's take a look at the markings on our C9B skin. We can see here that we're going to be attaching to the F5 former on this side and the F4 former on this side. These instructions here tell us that we're going to be doing it at the 6 o'clock position, and we see that we're going to have a flush fit here on the front edge. If we look at some other markings, we're going to see that we're going to be adding a couple bevels, one on each side of the score on this piece, and the same here. And just like with many of the other pieces, we're going to be peeling the paper away, and this is going to be attached using the glue and wrap method. Let's start by peeling all the paper off the skin on the side with the markings. Once we've got our paper removed, use the backside of a razor blade and let's run it down the score on each of these doors. Open it up, and I'm going to add a bevel here and a bevel here. I'll flip it over and add a couple more bevels. I'm going to close the doors. I'm going to add a bead of glue right down the hinge, and using a piece of scrap, I'm going to wipe away the excess glue. Before the glue cools, I'm going to open them up all the way and hold it here for about 20 seconds. Just like we did on our first skin, we need to open up two scores using the backside of a razor. To ensure we're doing the right ones, I'm going to line this ruler up to the inside edge of our auxiliary inlet. Open that one and then move it over and do the same. There we go. That looks really good. Next, let's add some shape here in the middle on either side, and then here on the outer edges. You can see I'm not really adding shape to the doors. I'm leaving them pretty flat. Now the one thing I want to do is we're going to have a pretty hard bend right here on these first two scores. So I'm going to take and bend this over. Now you'll see that I'm holding my hand very flat and I'm bending the sheet over using my hand and also my wrist. I'm going to bend it over a few times, each time going a little bit further. I'm being very careful not to crinkle the foam. Flip around, do the same over here. All right, once that's done, let's go ahead and do a test fit, and we'll start getting the skin glued in place. To do our test fit, I'm first going to ensure that I'm attaching the correct edge to the F5 former. I'm going to line up the reference marks right in the middle, and then moving up towards the front, I'm going to line the reference marks there as well. Next, I'm going to apply a heavy bead of glue along this bottom stringer. Also going to apply a little bit of glue right here in the middle along the edge of the skin. Line up my reference marks. The piece that I'm gluing in place will shingle over the piece that I'm gluing to just slightly. Got a little bit of pressure this way to create that shingling effect. As I'm holding it in place, I'm also making sure that my reference marks are centered up here at the front. We'll let the glue cool down for about 2 minutes before moving on. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we're going to be gluing the skin to the former. We're going to begin by applying a heavy bead of glue along the bottom side of this F5 former. Once we add glue, we pull the skin around, and you'll see that we are just shingling over this section of skin. I'm going to run my bead of glue all the way up to the notch. I'll apply pressure downward and hold in place for a full 2 minutes. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we're going to do the same thing on the other side. Now that we've got the skin attached to the F5 former, we need to install the F3, F4 former. Now we see here that we've got the word flush fit. So we're going to be doing a flush fit to the F4 former, which are the two wider ones. In order to do that, we're going to look at it from the top, and what I'm looking at is I want to make sure that the face of the former is flush with the edge. Once it's lined up on both sides, I'm going to come inside with my razor blade and make a small cut in our stringer. Next, I'm going to cut off the excess. And we're going to be able to drop this straight down and glue it in place. Once we're happy with the test fit, I'm going to apply a bead of glue along the bottom of the F4 formers, and I'll also apply a bit of glue here on the sides of the stringer and right here on the formers. And drop this straight down. I'm going to line up the front of the formers so that they're flush against the edge of the skins, and we're going to hold it in place for a full 2.5 minutes. Before we go any further, I want to cut away a portion of this stringer so that our auxiliary inlet doors will freely open. You can see when I try to open it, it's making contact. So I'm going to go in here and cut a small bevel. Okay, still making contact, so I'll come in here and remove a little bit more material. There we go. And do the same thing on the other side. That looks good. Next, we're going to add our stringer. But before I do, I want to move my assembly and check my work area for any glue buildup. In order to have the best looking model, you're constantly going to have to be removing small pieces of glue that have dripped down. To test fit our first stringer, I'm simply going to shove that in the number 5 former and slide it up underneath this F4 former. Yeah, it looks really good. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of glue here on the end, and we'll push that in. And then I'll add a little bit of glue right here. And we can shove that in. While we're at it, I'm going to run a bead of glue down both sides. I'm going to rotate my model slightly, and we're going to press straight down. Once that's done, you can do the same thing on the other side. If you remember earlier, when we were adding shape to the skin, I was bending the piece over along those first 2 scores using my whole hand and my wrist. We're going to be doing the same thing when attaching the skin on this next step. I want to make sure that when I'm attaching the skin, that it is shingling over the skin that I'm gluing it to. So once I'm happy with my fit, I'm going to add a bead of glue underneath this notch all the way down to the next stringer. Using my hand and wrist, I'm going to gently bend this skin over. It's going to shingle over the part we're gluing to. One thing I want to point out, when wrapping and gluing this piece in place, make sure this is all the way closed. You can see the way I'm holding the assembly. I've got it where I can rotate and see the underside, and I'm keeping pressure on the skin, pulling it towards myself as the glue's cooling down. Don't get in a hurry on this step. You want to make sure the glue has plenty of time to cool. Before we go any further, let's add another stringer. I'll start by applying a little bit of glue here on the end, and we're going to be feeding it into this notch on the F5 former. I'm not going to glue this in place just yet. Let's go ahead and get our skin secured. In order to glue our skin in place, we're going to be applying a bead of glue from the stringer all the way up to just below the stringer. Once we've added our glue, I'm going to rotate our whole assembly, and we're going to press straight down. And remember, we want the edge of the skin flush with the former. Apply a heavy bead of glue here. And I'm going to push straight down. Hold this in place for a full 2.5 minutes while the glue cools. Now that I've got the skin glued front and back, I'm going to run a bead of glue along the stringer where it meets the skin. I'm going to rotate my assembly where I can push straight down on the stringer. One last area we can add glue to is where the stringer meets the former. As that's cooling down, we can go ahead and put our next stringer in place. Add a little bit of glue here on the end. Add glue to 3 sides and then a little bit on the end. We'll drop it in place and we'll drop the stringer into the notch, and we will hold off on gluing it in place. You want to make sure this is pushed in, and I'll hold this while the glue cools. Once that's cooled down, we're going to glue this section of the skin. I want to double check that everything fits good. You can see that I'm slightly shingling over this skin here. I'm going to shoot a bead of glue along the edge of that former, and I'm going to run it all the way up over that stringer. I'm going to hold that in place for a full 2 minutes while the glue cools, then we'll start making our way forward. Next, we're going to glue the skin onto this F4 former. You'll notice whenever I close it, I'm going to need to pull this former forward just slightly. I'm going to add a bead of glue here on the stringer, run it down the edge of the former as best I can, and I'm going to gently close it. I'll probably need to get a piece of scrap and remove that excess glue. And I'm going to hold this in place for a couple minutes, and then we're going to add a bead of glue where the skin meets the stringer. Now that that's had a chance to cool, I'm going to add a bead of glue between the stringer and the skin. And using a ruler, I'm going to apply even pressure between the two formers. If it's easier, you can roll the entire assembly upside down and put downward pressure. You can flip the assembly upside down and use the tabletop as a straight edge. It's just a little bit tricky with this extra shape in here. You might have to hang it off the edge of the table just slightly. Next, we're going to shift our attention to the spline. The spline is a little bit tricky, so I want to go over how it goes together. Let's begin by bringing the front half and the back half together, as indicated by our symbol mapping. And we'll do the same on the other one. Once that's done, we're going to be adding this small wooden plate. You're going to see 3 reference marks here, here, and here. We're going to be dropping this plate right here. And if we look at our marking right here, we're going to be sandwiching this wooden piece between 2 H1s. Which is this piece here. So we'll drop this on, and we're going to be gluing these 2 assemblies together. And make sure they're laying right on top of one another. We can see we've got some bevel symbols here, so let's go ahead and add those bevels. And we'll flip it over and do the same on the other side. Once that's done, go ahead and grab your fuselage assembly, and let's go ahead and remove a portion of the F7 former. So if we check out the symbol mapping on our F7 former here at the back, you'll see that we're going to be using a razor blade to remove this channel. Once that's been removed, we're going to be dropping our spline assembly into place. You can see I'm dropping the spline down in the channel we just created. And if you look at the formers going forward, it's going to drop down into the notches. We're going to push it down until the top is flush. Once that's in place, let's go ahead and run a bead of glue where the former meets the spline. Let's give the glue some time to cool before moving on. Once the spline's been glued in place, I'm going to take a pair of 17-gram servos. I'm going to rough up one of the sides. And we're going to be gluing it in this open area. The top of the servo is going to be flush with the top of the wood. Add some glue and drop it in place. Once that's done, we're going to do the same thing on the other side. It'll probably be necessary to remove the decal before gluing it in place. I want to make sure that both of my gears are either both forward or both backwards. Once that's done, let's take a look at our FR8 former. You can see that FR8 is going to be tab fitting into the H1. So we can see that it's going to go right here I'm going to drop that tab in and I'm going to pinch it so it'll go in a little bit easier. There we go. I want to make sure that my former is flush there at the top. Apply a heavy bead of glue and glue it in place. And I'll hold that in place for a full 2 minutes. Once the glue cools, I'll do the same thing on the other side. Once that's glued in place, let's drop our F9, F10 former in place. You can add glue anywhere the former meets the spline. Make sure as the glue is cooling down, look at it from the top to make sure that it's perpendicular to the spline. Once all our formers are in place, we need to run some wires. Since my wire's coming out of the back of my servo in this case, I'm going to stretch it around the side and run it through that screw hole. I'm going to put just a drop of glue down there to kind of hold it in place. I want to make sure that that wire doesn't come loose and interfere with the control arm down the road. As that's cooling down, I want to talk about these 3 extensions. I've got a 60mm extension connected to a 20mm extension. We're going to connect the servo wire. We're going to feed it through this hole in the former, this hole, this center hole, and we'll run it about that far. Make sure that you tape the connection. You can do the same thing on the other side. If you look at the F8 former, you're going to notice that this side has a little bit taller cutout than on the other side. We're going to feed another one of our 60mm connected to a 20mm extensions through the F6, F7 former. We want to make sure that we're doing it on the same side as this tall cutaway. Now that we've got our wires run, let's add our next skin. Once we've got the 2 elevator and the rudder wires, let's go ahead and feed our ESC wires through. There's one. Now that we've got our wires through, let's add our next skin. Once you've got all your wires run and you've double checked that you've got all your connections taped, we're going to add the next skin. Go ahead and locate C10A from your kit. Before gluing our next skin in place, let's go ahead and add our next stringer. You'll notice that I went ahead and glued both sides. Since the formers have been glued to the spline, we don't have to worry about anything moving anymore. One more thing I want to point out, this stringer is right in the middle of this stack of 3. Once that's done, do the same thing on the other side. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we're ready to add the skin. Before we get started, let's take a look at our C10A skin. You're going to notice that over here on the side, we're not going to be removing the paper. So let's just remove the paper here in the middle. Once we've got the paper removed, we're going to flip the part over, and using a ruler, I'm going to locate a reference mark here and over here. I'm going to lay a straight edge between the two reference marks, and I'm going to carefully cut just through the paper. Now, every aircraft I do, there always seems to be a favorite step. This by far is my very favorite thing on this aircraft. You're about to learn something new. We're going to be adding some curve to this part, but we're going to be going in two different directions. Before we start adding shape, I want to very carefully peel away the paper. I'm going to set this paper off to the side. We're going to need it again in just a little bit. Now that we've got our paper removed, I'm going to flip my part over and we're going to add shape anywhere we see these scores. All right, once we've got shape added in the middle, we're now going to add a reverse curve to this area right here. When doing this reverse curve, it is very important that your table does not have any glue. It's also very important that you've got a nice gentle curve. You don't want a hard edge. We want to have a nice smooth curve, but we don't want to tear up this foam. So if you look at our part, we now have a curve going this way and then a curve going the opposite way. Let's do the same thing on the other side. So that looks really good. I think we're going to be able to work with that. Let's go ahead and do a quick test fit. When doing our test fit, we're going to start on one side and then work our way to the other. It doesn't matter if you start on the right or on the left. It's all personal preference. I'm going to start over here on the right side, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and I'm going to push this down. I want to make sure that this back edge is flush. That looks good. And I'm going to start by carefully applying a bead of glue right along this edge. I'm going to bring a bead of glue up along the former, and I'm going to bring it all the way along this stringer. And then I'm going to carefully drop this part in. You can see that I'm coming in at an angle, and then I'm going to flatten it against the former. What that does is that shoots all that excess glue on the inside where it'll be hidden. And as the glue's cooling, I'm making sure that the white area is flush with the brown down below. The F4 Phantom really had some interesting curves. I'm really excited about this technique, and it's going to be really interesting to see how this technique is going to work on other aircraft. I've always wanted to do a B-1 bomber, but it always had just some crazy reverse curves, but seeing how this turned out gives me hope that even a plane with complex curves like that will be very possible in the future. Once that's had a chance to cool down, I'm going to gently fold everything over and I want to line it up. I want to examine the area between the skin and the former. I want to make sure I don't have any gaps. If I do have a gap, I'm going to have to take a little sliver off this edge. I might have a little bit of a gap here at the back. I'm going to turn this around so you can see it. Yeah, I've got just a little bit of a gap. I think I can tighten that up just a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I've got a straight edge here, and I didn't have a gap up there at the front. So I'm going to run my straight edge right up to that corner. And I'm going to remove just a small sliver here, starting here at the back. And it's going to taper to nothing as we go to the front of the aircraft. Very carefully removing just a little material at a time. Got my line defined using the straight edge. Now I can go and freehand it. I'll cut a little bit of a bevel. By cutting a little bit of a bevel, that'll close just a little bit easier. So now when I close that closed the gap. That was just enough. If you do end up with a little bit of a gap, don't worry about it. If it's too big, you can always fill it with some lightweight spackle. But whenever we add our paper back on, that paper will overlap and it'll also close that gap. Okay, our fit looks good. Let's start gluing. On this next step, we're going to be adding glue all along the top of this former, along the spline, across the stringer, and along the edge. So there's a lot of glue that's got to be applied very quickly. It's easy to get messy, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a piece of tape right up along this paper's edge. We can get by with glue dripping down on the inside. It's all going to be hidden, but I want to make sure that I don't get any glue running down the side. So this tape is going to help us out. Also, I'm going to add glue along the edge of this skin last. Shoot some glue up under there, and I'm only applying glue to 2 of the 4 formers. And I'm only adding glue over on the right side. I will want to have a piece of scrap on standby because we're likely to have some glue squirt out. Okay, I'm going to run glue right along this edge. Close this. And as soon as I've got it the way I want it, I'm going to peel this tape away. If there's any glue squirting out, it'll take that glue with it. So you can see how nice and clean that looks. Got a really good fit right there. And as the glue's cooling, I'm making sure that the white is flush with the brown where the 2 edges are coming together. Make sure you give this a full 2.5 minutes. You want to make sure that this doesn't shift in any way. So if I look back here, I can see that didn't quite glue where I wanted it to. I'm going to shoot a bead of glue up inside there. I'm going to apply a gentle pressure so that we have that reverse curve. And I'll hold that for 2.5 minutes while the glue cools. I also need to run down a piece of scrap and wipe away some of that excess. Once the skin's been glued in place, we're going to reapply the paper that we earlier removed. My very favorite glue for this is Aleene's Tacky glue. You can get this off Amazon, you can get it at any craft store. It's kind of like school glue, but extremely thick. I really like the way this glue works. What I want to do is I'm going to be applying glue to the foam, being very careful not to hit the foam with the glue nozzle. It's real easy to dent that foam. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to gently smooth this glue out. If it gets down there on the brown paper, don't worry about it. It's water soluble. We'll be able to wipe off all the excess once we get the paper put back on. The key to having this paper look perfectly smooth is you want to make sure that you don't have any excess glue on here. So if you look close, you're going to see some little ridges. I want to completely eliminate those. Okay, that looks good and smooth. Now I'm going to reapply the paper. And once that's done, using a damp cloth, I'm going to continue to smooth it out, but it'll also remove all the excess glue we've got all over the place. So using a wet paper towel, I'm simply going to smooth it out a little bit more. If the glue's not coming off, just add a little bit more water. So look at that, all nice and smooth. Go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. Once that's done, let's go ahead and start working on our next skin. C11A is very similar. We're going to start by removing paper here in the middle. And just like we did on the previous skin, we're going to flip it over, locate the two reference marks, and we're going to cut just through the paper. Carefully remove the paper. And we'll set that off to the side. We'll add our shape in the middle. So I've got some glue buildup right here. So I'm going to move down to an area that doesn't have any glue. And I'll create my reverse curve. On this reverse curve, I'm just going to add a little bit of curve here at the front on the side that attaches to the F7. We may come back and add a little more. Let's see how it looks. I'll do a quick test fit, line up my reference marks there at the top, and I think we'll be good. Curve is matching up nicely. Now what's going to be a little bit tricky on this part is if we glue this in place and we don't wait for the glue to fully cool down, whenever we push it down in the back, it's going to create a gap right here. So we really want to make sure that we give this plenty of time to cool down before gluing it at the back. Our test fit looks good, so I'm going to add a bead of glue here along the former and where the skin is, all the way down. Line up my reference mark there at the top, and I am shingling over the part that I'm gluing this to. I'm adding a little bit of a bend with my thumb, create that reverse curve. I want to make sure I'm flush. That looks good. Now I'm going to hold this in place for 2.5 minutes. I'm not even going to breathe. I don't want this to move. Before I glue it at the back, I'm going to glue this edge. I'm going to roll my whole fuselage over. I want to make sure that my tabletop is clean. Again, this is something you cannot check enough. Make sure you don't have any glue. And I'm going to roll this where I can easily see not only the former, but also the edge of the other skin. So I'm running a bead of glue along the skin. I'm trying to get it right up there to the edge of the paper. And I'm going to go back and run it over the former a little bit. Now I can rotate it back up. And I can make sure it's shingling over, and I'm pressing in with my thumb to make sure I've got that reverse curve, and I'm just going to hold this in place. So I'm looking right here, and I can see I've got a little bit of a gap, so I'm going to shoot some glue in there. Before going any further, I'm going to apply a small piece of tape down here at the bottom. When I bring this skin over to the former, there's a lot of pressure right here. And I want to make sure that it doesn't pop loose. Run a bead of glue underneath here. And I'm going to squeeze and hold until the glue's had a chance to cool. Once that's done, you can do the same thing on the other side. Once all that's had a chance to cool down, you can see that I've got quite a bit of play right here. We've got a reference mark right here in the middle, so whenever we glue the skin down, we're probably going to need to move the tail one way or the other. This will need to be held in place while the glue cools. Pull it over to center and apply pressure. You also need to wipe away any excess glue using a piece of scrap. Once that's done, let's go ahead and add glue and reapply the paper. Somehow this piece of paper fell on the floor and I stepped on it. No big deal. I'm just going to use it as a template and cut out another piece. There we go. So you can see I've got a lot of puckering right there. It means my glue is too thick. I'm going to peel that off and wipe away some of that excess glue. You see I'm wiping in the same direction. It's pushing some of that excess glue towards the seam. I do have a little crack in there, so it's probably going inside that. That's why you don't see it shooting out. That isn't too bad. One other thing you can do is if you've got a hobby iron, you can take 2 layers of tape, put the 2 sticky sides together, you can lay it on there and you can smooth things out with a hobby iron, but I think it'll be okay once it dries. I've been working that paper quite a bit, and I think it just got a little bit wet. I think it finally went through that water-resistant layer. We'll let that cool and we'll revisit that a little later. The next skin we're going to do is labeled C12A. It's a really straightforward piece. We're just going to peel the paper, add the shape, and attach it using the glue and wrap method. You can see that I primarily just added shape down the middle. The reason for that is if you look at our former here, most of the shape is right here in the middle. The sides are fairly straight. Once I get the shape I want, I'm going to line up the reference mark there in the center and glue it to the first former. Got a little glue getting away from me. Let's try that again. I'll hold that in place for a couple minutes while the glue cools, then I'll do the same thing on the other side. Now that we've got the front of the skin secured, let's take a look here at the back. Just like we did on the previous skin, we may have to move this spline one way or the other. I'm pretty straight, but I am going to need just a little bit of pressure to the right. Now, as I wrap this around, you can see that I didn't do a really good job of gluing this in place. I've got a pretty good gap there. This gap is going to vary depending on your build, so it's no big deal. When I put the next section on, I may have to carve out a little bit of material to clear there, but you're going to run into stuff like this. The good thing about these foam board models, they're real easy to fix if you make small mistakes. Make sure I'm centered, and I'm going to glue that in place. Once that cools, I'll do the same thing on the other side. For a C13 skin, We're going to go ahead and peel away all the paper. Once we get all the paper peeled away, use the back side of your razor blade, and we're going to run down this score and this score. We're going to break this back, and where you see a triple score, we're going to take and fold it over. You can see I'm using the whole palm of my hand to bend it. I want to make sure this stays in a straight line. If you just go and bend one corner or the other, you're going to get some crinkles. If you just take your hand and roll it, you can mash it all the way down, and if you look, I don't have any crinkles. Do the same on the other side. Next, we're going to add a little bit of shape where the scores are. And let's take a look at our former. So if we look at our former, we're going to see that we need quite a bit of shape here in the middle. So let's go ahead and add that now. There we go. If we look at our symbol mapping, we see that we're going to be attaching this skin to the F9, F10 former, which is this one right here. We will be using the glue and wrap method just like we've done before. The difference on this skin is instead of it being open on the bottom, as we see here, this one is going to be a closed shape. When everything is said and done, these two edges are going to be glued together. But instead of them being glued together like this, they're actually going to be glued together at a 45-degree angle. So our finished shape is actually going to look like this. Now you can see when we bring those two edges together, we've got that big, huge white gap. So to get rid of that, we're going to take our razor blade and we're going to cut a bevel down both edges. So now when we bring these two edges together, we're going to have a shape that looks like this. So now that we've got a game plan, let's begin here at the 12 o'clock position. We're going to line up our reference marks, and on my particular build, you can look, I've got a great big gap right here because I did a horrible job of attaching that former. I'm going to take and I'm going to cut away some material, and I'm going to give myself a little bit of clearance. So now once I align my reference mark at the top, this should work just fine. Once everything's together, you'll never know that I had a big giant mistake in there. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. Go ahead and cut away about the same amount of material. Checking the other side to make sure that I don't need to remove any more material. Looks like I've still got a little bit of a gap, so I'm going to remove just a little bit more. Once that's done, I'm going to add about an inch and add a little bit of glue along the spline. I'm not going to worry about going all the way down the spline right now. Need to fold my edges down and line this up. And as usual, I'm doing my best to make this piece slightly overlap this piece. We'll hold that in place and let it cool. Then we're going to flip the model upside down and try to get some more glue along that former where the skin meets. I need to get glue down here between the former and the skin. I can't pull the skin all the way away because it's being captured a little bit by this wooden spar. So I'm just going to drop glue down there as best I can. It doesn't take much to hold this in place. It's not real pretty, doesn't matter, it's all going to be hidden on the inside. Once I get my glue, I'm going to push that skin all the way forward where it's slightly shingling over the previous skin. I'll hold this in place until the glue cools. You can do the same thing on the other side once the glue is cooled. Like I've still got a little bit of material interfering, so I'm going to go and cut that away. It'll help that lay down a lot flatter. In order to do this next step without denting up the foam, we're going to want to fold the foam back over itself, and we're going to roll it over. We're only going to be gluing from about here to about here. If you try to just take and push it over, you're going to get a big dent somewhere along this foam. But if you fold it over and push it down while the glue's cooling, it'll stay nice and straight. Make sure and hold this for about 2.5 minutes. It's under a lot of pressure. If it doesn't cool all the way, it's going to spring right back open. Once the glue is cooled, you can do the same on the other side. So on this next step, we're going to be bringing these two halves together. They're going to be coming together right on the center line of the spline. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run a bead of glue down 1/2 of the spline. And I'm going to bring this edge to the center line of the spline, and I'm going to hold it in place while the glue cools. Once that's done, I'll add glue to the other half of the spline. I'll run a bead of glue down the edge of the skin, and I'll bring our two edges together. Hold this in place for a full 2.5 minutes while the glue cools, then we'll add our next section. My spline is just left of center. What I'm going to do is I'm going to shoot a little bit of glue on either side of the spline, and I'm going to scoot that spline over and center it, and I'll hold this in place for 2.5 minutes before adding the next skin. As I'm looking at this part, I'm noticing that up here at the front we've got a nice angle, but then it kind of puffs out just a little bit. I don't like the way it's doing that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and I'm going to push down with my ruler, and you can see how we're defining that channel just a little bit more. In order to get that to hold, I'm going to put my model up on the front, and I'm going to drop some glue down that score, and then I'll bring it back on the table, and I'm going to hold this ruler just a little bit of pressure against that score. Once the glue cools, that'll ensure that we hold the correct shape. I'm applying a pretty heavy bead of glue. I'm going to wait just a second while it drops down, and we'll bring it back up on the table and push down and hold. I'm probably going to hold this for a full 3 minutes. There's a ton of glue in there, and I want to make sure that it cools. I want to make sure it's fully cooled before doing the other side. This next skin we're going to be doing is the C14 skin. It's a really straightforward part. We're simply going to remove the paper, line up the reference marks, and attach it using the glue and wrap method. Start here in the center, work your way all the way around. You'll need to bevel the edges like we did on the previous part. Go ahead and cut those now. You'll notice we've got a pretty big V-shaped gap here at the back. That's okay. Once the glue cools, we're going to bring these two edges together. Now that the glue is cooled, I'm going to bring my edges together. You can see I've got a little bit of a gap. I'm going to have to remove a little bit of material from the spline. Once that's done, I should be able to bring these edges together. There's still a little bit of a gap. What I'm going to do is I'm going to apply glue to the edges, to the spline. I'm going to run a piece of tape around it and then pull it tight. That'll bring the edges together. First, I'm going to apply a piece of tape and I'm going to fold it backwards. We're going to bead a glue down one side of the spline, the other side of the spline, and along one edge of the skin. Pinch two together. Pull my tape tight, and that ought to get it. As the glue's cooling down, go ahead and grab the part labeled C15. If we look at the symbol mapping, we're going to be removing the paper, and anytime we see a circle, we're going to add shape and then bring the two edges together. I'm going to cut a small bevel on both edges. Apply glue and bring my two edges together. It's really helpful to add a piece of tape, or you can just hold it for about 3 minutes. Now that we've got our edges glued together, I'm going to take a razor blade and cut away the excess foam. Next, I want to flatten out my part so that when I fit it up against the previous skin, it lines up. This last part is slightly bigger than this area right here, so there's going to be a little bit of an overlap. I'm going to add glue right here, and I'm going to bring my two parts together. I'm having to pinch just slightly to get the two pieces to fit together. On this next step, we're going to be building our battery box. When it comes out of the kit, this score is going to be broken. Let's go ahead and add glue here and here. As the glue's cooling down, use the back side of your razor blade and we're going to run down all of these scores. Let's remove the material. Once we've got the channels cleaned out, we're going to do B folds, and we're going to fold this up to form our battery box. The battery box is very simple to make. It's just a couple B folds, and you're all good to go. For this next step, let's go ahead and remove the paper from skin C8 and C9A. Once we get the paper removed, we're going to remove a little bit of material on the fuselage and we're going to test fit our C8 skin. We're going to be adding the C8 skin to this F3 former. You'll notice that this stringer is making contact with the former. So we go to attach the skin, this is going to be in the way. Rather than cutting it off, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a piece of scrap foam and I'm going to cut a little bit of material away so that I can slide that skin in. These stringers sticking out actually are really helpful whenever we go to add the skin for the intakes. Do the same on the other side. All right, once that's been done, let's go ahead and take a look at our C8 skin and let's put together a game plan. So taking a look at our C8 skin, we're going to see that we've got all our scores right here down the middle, and that corresponds to this arch here on the F3 former. Down here at the bottom, we've got a hard 90-degree angle, and that's represented by these scores over here on the sides. So let's go ahead and add some shape down the middle, and then we're going to break the edges over. Just like we've done on other steps, I'm using my entire hand and my wrist to bend the edge over. We're going to take it and we're going to flatten it all the way out. I'm being careful not to crinkle the foam. I'll do this several times. That'll really help break down the foam and we'll get a nice clean bend. Do the same on the other side. All right, once we've done that, I'm going to bring my two edges together just like this. Test fit looks good. I'm going to add a bead of glue along one side. And as always, when bringing the two edges together, the side that does not have glue will shingle over the side that does have glue. You'll notice when I bring my edges together, they're kind of angled, and I bring them up and that shoots all that excess glue to the middle where it will be hidden. It's helpful to have some tape on standby to lay across the seam anywhere it looks good. On the C8 skin, we're going to see the word flush fit on the side that calls out for the F2 former. So whenever we install the F2 former, it's going to be a flush fit. Let's go ahead and test that out now. I'm going to line up my reference mark there at the top. And try to fit my F2 former in place. It's a little bit snug. As a rule of thumb, I always want my formers to fit loosely. This really helps when attaching the next skin. As a rule of thumb, I always prefer my formers to fit loosely. Let's just roll the edge. That'll crush the foam a little bit. That fits a lot better. Okay, that looks good. Now, one thing that I do want to point out, make sure that you have these circles with hashtags facing forward. You want to make sure that those aren't facing the inside. Now that we've got our test fit, let's go ahead and pull the F2 former out. Once that's done, we're going to test fit the C8 skin over the F3 former. I'm going to slide it up here beside the stringer where we added some clearance. I'm going to center the reference mark right along the center of the spline. I'm going to flip my entire assembly upside down. And I'm going to push the skin all the way up until it makes contact with the next skin. All right, we're looking really good. Now, if you remember, we also removed this C9A skin. Let's go ahead and add some shape to that real quickly. Taking a look at the markings, I see over here that this is going to attach to the F4 former, and this is going to be attaching to the F5 former. That tells me this is the front, and the other is the back. What I'm going to do is I'm going to line up my reference mark there in the back, and line it up here. You'll notice that I've got a little bit of a gap. So I'm going to push my skin back just a little bit. I want to make sure that after this is glued in place, that I've got the correct spacing, so when we go back at the end of this build, we can add this final plate. Now that we've got our C8 skin test fitted, I'm going to slide the skin forward just a little bit, and I'm going to run some glue along the former. I'm going to make sure my reference line is centered, and I'm going to push this back. I'm going to wipe away the excess glue really quickly, and I'm going to drop my next skin in place to make sure that my gap is correct. I'd rather have it a little bit snug than too loose. If I need to remove a little bit of material from this skin later on, that's okay. Once I'm happy with the position, I'm going to push down all along the top of the former. I want to make sure that glues correctly to the former. Once that's had a chance to cool down, let's flip the assembly upside down. And I want to bring these two edges together, closing that gap. I'm going to take a long piece of tape, and bring my two edges together. I want to make sure that my seam is lined up to the reference mark, and I'm going to stretch my tape across the seam. Once that's done, I now need to apply a bead of glue between the skin and the F3 former. It's a little tough to get to from this side, but if we look down inside, you can see where we can drop some glue between the skin and the formers. Once you've got glue applied, we're going to apply pressure to the side and hold it in place for a full 2.5 minutes while the glue cools. Then repeat the process on the other side. Next, we need to secure our spline. I'm going to drip glue right down the center and shoot a little glue down either side. I'm going to center it on the skin, press, and hold for a full 2.5 minutes. If your spline is sticking out past your skin, you can go ahead and trim away the excess. You can also trim it once you get your former reinstalled. Inside our assembly, you're going to see a dotted line. What I want to do is I've taken a piece of scrap that came from one of my formers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a bead of glue, maybe 1/2 inch or so from one edge. I'm going to drop this piece of scrap right inside. My glue line is just above this dotted line. So you can see that I'm down almost 2 inches. I'm going to hold this in place while the glue cools. If it's not centered exactly, or it's a little high or a little low, it's not going to matter. For this next step, we're going to be adding the main spar. You're going to notice a vertical knockout on either side of the fuselage. Go ahead and run your spar through those two knockouts. When running my spar through, I am making sure that all my wires are above the spar and not below. Once you get your spar run through, use your ruler and get it centered. Once you've got your spar centered, we need to glue it in place. To make things easier, let's take and cut our spline. We'll want to save this. We're going to be gluing it back in place a little bit later. I'm going to run a little bit of glue where my spar meets that large stringer there at the bottom. And then I'm going to roll my assembly over and glue it where the spar meets the two stringers, one on either side. I'll see if I can hold it a little bit better where you can see that. There we go. We're going to let that cool, then we're going to add our battery box. Next, we're going to be installing the battery box. You'll notice one side has 3 holes. This is the end we're going to be pushing up inside the assembly. We're going to push the battery box in until it makes contact with the wooden spar. Once that's done, let's reinstall our F2 former. Installing this former is going to be a little bit tricky. Really take your time on this step. I'm having a little bit of an issue here at the bottom, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a bevel. This is really going to help that former slide in. By running my hand along the side, that's taking up any slop. There we go. See, I went in just a little bit too far. Slide my razor blade in, pull that out just a little bit. If it's in just a little past flush, that's okay. All right, once I'm happy with the position, I'm going to run a thin bead of glue between my battery box and the former. Also, next I'm going to run a bead of glue where the former meets the skin. Then I'm going to use a piece of scrap and wipe away all the excess. It's very important that you get all the glue that's sticking out past the skin removed, because our canopy assembly is going to slide on the battery box and fit flush against this F2 former. So it's really important that nothing is sticking out past the skin. It doesn't take a whole lot to hold this skin in place. There are a few other places that we're going to be gluing, so don't worry about getting glue between the former and the skin like we've done elsewhere. This will be more than adequate. You may notice you've got some dried glue that's dripped down from where the former meets the box. Using a razor blade, I am going to remove that. Now you'll want to build the nose of the aircraft. This is not covered in the unique features video. This is covered in the basics and beyond videos located in this playlist. If you check out the nose video and the canopy video, you'll have all you need to build this assembly. We still need to secure the battery box to the aircraft, but before we do that, we need to make sure that the nose fits on correctly. Up here at the front, I'm going to cut a small radius. And I'm also going to cut a very small V. I'm going to put a little bit of glue inside this V, and we're going to squeeze this closed. You can put a piece of tape across here. This is going to help the battery box feed into the nose of the aircraft. This is a really good time to add the magnets. You can always do it later, but you have the best access now. Once we've tapered the front end of the battery box, we're going to test fit the nose section. What I want to make sure is that the nose isn't canted one way or the other. I think this looks really good. So once I'm happy with the fit, if you look back here, inside the fuselage, you're going to see a big cutaway window and you're going to see 3 holes. I'm going to take and fill each of those holes with hot glue. You'll want to make sure that you give the glue plenty of time to cool before moving the aircraft. If you roll the aircraft over, that glue is going to run all over the place. You can also add a line of glue where the battery box meets the spar. If you get a little sloppy with the glue, that's okay. All this will be hidden inside the aircraft. The next 2 parts we're going to be putting on are the I1 and I2 skins. When they come out of your kit, they're going to be broken like this, so let's run a bead of glue right down the middle of each. Once you've glued down the center, go ahead and remove paper from both pieces. Now that we've got the paper removed, let's take a look at the symbol mapping. So if we take a look at our part, we see that this skin labeled I1 is going to be attaching to the former F3 at the 6 o'clock position. Well, we know that this is the F2 former. So this has to be the F3 former. We can no longer see it, but we can see that we have a problem. You'll notice this dotted line. We're going to remove this piece of foam and that will expose the F3 former. If you remember, on this skin, we glued the top, we glued the sides, but there was no instruction given to add glue to the bottom. The reason we didn't add glue is because we're going to be gluing this piece in place instead of this one. Let's go ahead and play connect the dots using our razor blade. I'm not going to press down too terribly hard because if you remember, we put a little piece of scrap inside here. Once we've played connect the dots, you can remove your foam. You'll see the piece of scrap that we added. You'll also see the F3 former. Before we go too far, I'm going to lift this piece of scrap up and I'm going to glue this to the battery box. Once we've got that open, let's take a look at our skin. We know that it's going to be glued across the bottom. We're going to be lining up the reference marks. Here at this corner, we've got a pretty sharp edge, but you can start to see how the scores are starting to widen out. Instead of it being a really sharp bend, it's going to start to get smoother as we go towards the front of the skin. Out here on the outer edges, it's a pretty gentle shape that we're going to be adding. So let's go ahead and add some shape now. Here at the back, it's going to be more of a 90 degree. So you can see that I'm bending it at the back, but I'm not bending it as much here at the front. Do the same on the other side. And then along this area, I'm going to go ahead and add some shape. I want to add just a little bit of shape here, but it really stays pretty straight. So I don't want to add very much. All right, once we've added our shape, I want to drop the skin in place. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to examine my seam. My seam looks really good all the way across. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add glue all along the former. I'm going to add glue to these stringers sticking out. I'm going to add glue to the edge of the skin here and here. Let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm getting it on the former and the edge of the skin, adding it to the stringer, edge of the skin, and same over here. I'm double checking that I'm attaching the correct side to the former. I'm going to line up my reference mark. The part that I'm gluing in place is going to shingle over the part that I'm gluing to. I'm going to hold this in place until the glue has had a chance to cool. This is a really good time to go ahead and shove your wires inside the battery box. We're going to be flipping the model over back and forth a whole lot. It's really good to have these things out of the way where they won't dent up any of the skins. Now that that's had a chance to cool, let's run a bead where the fuselage skin meets the skin for the intake. I'll do the same on the other side. While that's cooling down, go ahead and play connect the dots here on the fuselage. And if you look inside these windows I've cut, you'll see that we've got venting on the battery box. This really helps keep the ESCs cool during flight. Once that's had a chance to cool, we're going to be using the glue and wrap method to connect this skin to the previous one. I'm going to run a bead of glue on each of these stringers and then along the edge of the skin. I'm running a pretty heavy bead of glue and I'm running it right up to the paper. Once I get my glue added, I'm going to press down right here at the corner. I don't want that to pop up, and I'm going to shingle that over just slightly. I'll hold this in place for 2.5 minutes and then continue to work my way around. Once that's done, we're going to add a little bit more glue to the stringer here and run a bead down the edge of this skin as best we can. And we're going to bring the two edges together. We're going to repeat the process on the other side. I am not going to be applying any glue between the intake and the fuselage at this time. We'll do that on a later step. To get the very best seams, it's important to always get that glue all the way up to the edge of the paper. Once your edges have been glued together, let's run a bead of glue underneath the skin. And we're going to gently press this down and hold. You can see I've got a little bit of a gap in there. That's okay. We don't need to just push it all the way down. We'll let that glue fill the gap. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we're going to be connecting I2 to the I1 skin. We're going to line up the reference mark right in the middle, and we're going to drop this straight down. Your fit should be pretty good, but if you need to remove a little bit of material, you can always remove it this section right here. So I'm looking at my skins, and it looks like I can add glue between my fingers here, and then we're going to add a little bit of glue here in the middle. Running my bead of glue right up to the edge of the paper. I'm going to run a little bit of glue right here where the paper meets the foam, and I'm going to run some glue right here. Line up my reference mark. You see I'm attaching it there in the front first, and then I'm going to press down. And by doing that, that's going to push all that excess glue to the inside. I want to make sure we're flush across here, but also flush across here. We're kind of transitioning just a little bit in terms of height. Looks like I popped loose. I'm going to add some glue here. You can see I flipped my model upside down, and I'll flip it back over. And I'll hold it in place while it cools. Before installing our I2 skin, let's add shape to the following areas: here, 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 and here. All right, once that's done, let's go ahead and glue it in place. Once that's been glued in place, we're going to work our way around. I want to match this curve here. Make sure I can bring these two edges together with a slight overlap. I'm going to flip this over where I can see the edge. And I'm going to run a bead of glue probably up to this little cutout there in the skin. Flip it back over. Flipping it back over so I can see the seam just a little bit better. And I'll hold that in place while the glue cools. Once it cools, I'm going to continue to work my way around. Once this is glued in place, I'm going to run a straight edge along the I1 skin, and I'm going to trim off the excess here on the I2 skin. I left these long intentionally just in case you don't have the center line lined up correctly. You can still have a good seam once you attach the intake to the fuselage later on in the build. Once this is done, repeat the process on the other side. Once the I2 skin has been glued in place, we can go ahead and finish out both the intakes. I'm going to start with the right hand one. We see that the R1 is going to be attaching to the I2 skin. Once that's in place, we're going to be hooking the R2 skin to the R1 skin. Once we do the right side, we'll turn around and do the left side. Let's start by removing all the paper from R1 and R2. Let's go ahead and add shape to the areas with scores. If we look at our symbol mapping, we're going to see an arrow up here in this corner. We're going to be attaching this using the glue and wrap method. We're going to start right up here. We're going to glue a little bit and work our way around. Once that cools down, we'll continue to work our way around. Looking at our R2 skin, we're going to be doing the exact same thing. I'm going to be adding some shape about here and some shape about here. If you look up here in the corner, you're going to notice an arrow. That's going to tell us where to start the glue and wrap process. I'm going to begin by putting a little bit of glue right here. I'm running that glue all the way up to the edge of the paper, overlapping just slightly. And just like before, I'll work my way all the way around. I'm pressing downward with my thumb. This is helping the two edges come together a little better. Once you get your R2 skin glued in place, go ahead and remove these two plates from your kit. You're going to notice one edge is flat and the other is rounded. The flat edge goes down. What we're going to do is we're going to drop this plate right along the bottom edge of the intake. We want to get it where we can press straight down. Next, we're going to match the upper edge of the intake up against the top of the plate. So if you look at it from the other side, you're going to see that it's flush. So you can see that I'm flush here, here at the back, and then I'm also flush at the bottom. Once we know how this goes in and we're happy with our test fit, I'm going to run a heavy bead of glue here along the bottom and here at the top. Hold this in place for a full 2.5 minutes while the glue cools, then repeat the process on the other side. Now that we've got the intakes done, I'm going to go ahead and install some push rod housings. I've got two of the push rod housings cut to approximately 4 3/4 inches. I'm going to feed them through these two slots, one on the left and one on the right. I'm going to aim them right towards that servo, and I'm going to put a small amount of glue right here. Glue starts to get away, you can wipe it away using some scrap. Do the same thing on the other side. There we go. I'm going to cut a third push rod housing to approximately 8 3/4 inches. This is going to feed over on the right hand side of the aircraft. It's going to go through this pill-shaped slot. We're going to feed it through the tall slot on the F8 form. I'm going to secure the push rod housing by dropping a little bit of glue right here in the middle. While the glue's cooling, I'm going to go ahead and make my first bend on this light landing gear wire. We're going to use light landing gear wire for the elevators. Included with most 17-gram servos, there's going to be a long arm and a short arm. I prefer to use the long arm. Using an X-Acto knife, I'm going to open up the outermost hole just slightly. Once done, let's go ahead and do a second one. Once this is done, ensure that your servos have been centered. Then we're going to feed the push rod through the housing and attach the servo arms to the servo. Once you've ensured that your servos have been centered, you can feed your first push rod through the housing. And we'll attach our arm to the servo. Once you've got your arm installed, you can go ahead and screw it down. If you haven't already installed your magnet, you can always drop a magnet there on your screwdriver so you don't lose your screw. Once that's done, do the same thing on the other side. Next, we're going to install our rudder servo and push rod. For my rudder servo, I'm going to go ahead and attach my control arm. I'm going to rough up the back side. And let's go ahead and feed the push rod through the outermost hole. Once that's done, I'm going to feed it through the push rod housing. Next, we need to glue our servo in place. It's a little bit tricky to hold it in place, so something that I like to do, I like to run my barbecue skewer through one of these screw holes. That'll help hold it in place while it's getting glued. Just like that. I think that looks good. I'll have access to the screw if I need to service this at a later time. Add some glue to the back. If your barbecue skewer doesn't fit, you can always glue it on temporarily. Once you've got your servo in place, drop some glue where the former meets the push rod housing. I am making sure that this servo arm, when it swings over, isn't going to make contact. I may need to push it down just a little bit. Hold that in place while the glue cools. Then we need to attach our servo wire to our servo extension and test it. Now that we've got the rudder and elevator servos hooked up, let's go ahead and work on our horizontal stabilizers. So we've got both our left and right horizontal stabilizers here. Let's check out the symbol mapping. We see that we're going to be removing foam here and here, and here on the other. We're also going to be adding some bevels. Let's go ahead and start by removing foam where indicated. Once we've got our foam removed, I'm going to go down each of the scores with the backside of a razor blade. We'll break it open and add bevels everywhere indicated by the symbol mapping. Do the same on the other. We're going to add a line of glue along the elevator hinge. Once I've added glue, I'm going to wipe it away using a piece of scrap. And we'll leave it in the open position until the glue's had a chance to cool. We'll do the same thing on the other side. Once that's done, we're going to fold the horizontal stabilizer over on itself. When we fold it over, it's really important that this lines up perfectly. You can see that I'm off just a little bit, so I'm going to unfold it, shift it just a little bit, and now that knockout lines up top and bottom. You'll notice that I have a stair step. That's okay. The F4 Phantom has an angled horizontal stabilizer, and we're going to need that in order to get the correct shape. Once we've got a good test fit, I'm going to run a bead of glue down the seam there in the middle and run quite a bit of glue here in this open space. Again, I'm double checking that my knockout is lined up perfectly. It's very important that you do not get any glue inside of these knocked out areas. We're going to hold this in place till the glue cools. Hold this for about 2 or 2.5 minutes. We want to make sure it's had plenty of time to cool down. Once the glue is cooled down on our horizontal stabilizers, let's do our first test fit. I'm going to slide the spar up inside the horizontal stabilizer. Up here at the front of the horizontal stabilizer, you're going to see a small hole. We're going to line the front of the horizontal stabilizer up to that hole. Now you'll notice that we've got a little bit of a gap, and so what we're going to do is we're going to slide this off and we're going to cut a bevel on the underside. And we'll slide it back on. That looks really good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill this cavity part ways with glue. Then I'm going to run a bead of glue here along this edge. I'm also going to add a bead of glue along the doubler. Slide that back on. Make sure the front is lined up with the hole, and we're going to hold this in place while the glue cools. Once that's done, we can do the same thing on the other side. Once the glue's had a chance to cool, I want to make sure that I've got plenty of clearance for my elevator to go up and down. It looks like when I'm trying to go down, it's making contact, so I'm simply going to remove a little bit of material. It looks like we're pretty good. I might remove just a little bit more. I might be able to just get by with adding a small bevel. There we go. That gives me plenty of travel. I'll do the same thing on the other side. There we go. That looks good. Now I want to flip the model upside down, and I want to add a bead of glue where the horizontal stabilizer meets the fuselage on the underside. Once that's done, let's flip our model over and let's start working on our vertical stabilizer. Our vertical stabilizer needs a little bit of reinforcement. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our razor blade and play connect the dots. Once we've done that, locate this part in your kit. It's easily identified. You've got a score down the middle and a bookfold symbol map icon. Using the back side of my razor blade, I'm going to run down the score, fold it over on itself, and glue it together. Once I've got it glued, we're going to be dropping it down in this slot that I created. It's going to be a little bit too long, so I'm going to mark where I need to cut it with my razor blade, and then we'll cut off the excess. Looks like this wasn't quite wide enough, so I am going to widen this opening just a little bit. I think it might be time for a new blade. Still need to remove a little bit more. That looks better. We're going to be dropping this block straight down. There's a cutout in the spline that we're going to be gluing this to. Add a little glue here and a little glue coming up the side a little bit on either edge. Once that's in, I'm going to add a bead of glue. Do that on both sides. And now we're going to switch gears. We're going to work on the wings. We'll come back and finish out the vertical stabilizer a little bit later. Go ahead and locate the lower wing assembly and the 2 tabs for the right wing. Let's take a look at the symbol mapping on the lower wing skin. You'll see here and here, we're going to be removing the paper and we're going to be gluing a tab in place. We'll be doing the other one over here. There's 4 places where we're going to be removing foam. Here, 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 and here. Let's go ahead and do that now. Now that we've got the tabs glued in place and all the foam removed, let's go ahead and drop in our 17-gram servo. You can see that I've got my arm pointing straight down. As I put it in, I'm going to rotate it either forward or backwards. We want that to lay flush against the tabletop. Once it's in, we're going to run a bead of glue around the edge of the servo and give it a couple minutes to cool down. Once the glue cools, we're going to go ahead and fit our lower wing skin to the fuselage. Once that's had a chance to cool down, go ahead and open up the 2 slots on the side of the fuselage. Once the slots have been cleaned out, let's go ahead and slide our 2 tabs in. You'll want to slide the tabs towards the back of the slot. All right, once we're in, let's go ahead and put a bead of glue from the trailing edge of the wing all the way up to the tab. We'll hold that in place while the glue cools. Then we're going to start making our way forward. While the glue's cooling down, you can put a servo box near the end of the wing. It's just the right height. As we move towards the leading edge of the wing, I'm going to push the wing in, add a bead of glue, and I'll hold the wing in place while the glue cools. If you take a look at my right hand, it's right in line with the former. You never want to apply pressure between formers as it'll deform the foam. With the servo box underneath the wingtip, you can go ahead and glue the wooden spar to the lower wing skin. Next, we're going to drop our trailing edge spar in place. Just a quick note, if you notice that we're switching between the left wing and the right wing and then moving back, we shot the instructions a couple different ways and we're just going to mix and match and go with the instructions that we feel are the clearest. You can see that I've already glued the wooden spar to the back of this front spar. We're going to be dropping this in place. You'll notice that the wood on this spar is going to be making contact with the wood on this spar. Go ahead and add some glue to the bottom. And I'm going to apply glue right up to the point where the spar kicks up. I'm going to drop that down and hold it in place while the glue cools. Give that about 2.5 minutes. Then we're going to glue the wingtip. Once the glue's had a chance to cool, I'm going to lift the wingtip up until it makes contact with the wooden spar, and I'm going to run a bead of glue underneath. I'm going to bring that up and hold it in place while the glue cools. Make sure and give that a full 2.5 minutes before moving on. Located in your kit are 2 triangular shaped parts. You're going to need one for each wing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to fit this in between this spar and the wooden spar right here. Sometimes these need very little, if any, modification. Sometimes you've got to do quite a bit of cutting. This one looks like I've got to cut quite a bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a small reference mark right here. and one over here. When I make this cut, this will fit just on the inside of the two wooden spars. Once I've got my two reference marks, I'm going to line my straight edge and make the cut using a razor blade. Once that's cut, I'm going to do a test fit. It's a little bit loose, but that'll work. Since it's a little bit loose, I'm going to add a little glue here, and I'm going to glue that up against that spar. I'm going to hold this in place while the glue cools. Then I'm going to add a couple more beads. Once that's had a chance to cool down, I'm going to run a heavy bead right here. And I'll push it down to where the top is flush. Next, I'll add a heavy bead of glue here between the fuselage and this reinforcement. Add a little bit more glue if necessary between the reinforcement and the fuselage. Once that's had a chance to cool down, let's go ahead and attach our servo wire to a Y extension. There's a little pill-shaped hole right here. You can clean that out. And we can feed one end of the Y extension through, connect our servo, and let's tape our connection. Once that's done, let's pull it through and snug it up. I'm going to add a little bit of glue where it passes through. I'm going to add a 60mm extension to our Y, and I'll tape that connection as well. Now that we've got our wires hooked up, let's take a look at our upper wing skins. The upper wing skin consists of two parts. Let's take a look at our symbol mapping. We see that we're going to be removing the paper from here, and we're going to be removing the paper from here. We also have a couple areas where we've got the bevel symbol. Let's go ahead and do that now. Once we've got our paper removed, let's go ahead and add our bevels. You can see I'm doing a really steep bevel. For the aileron, I'm first going to use the backside of my razor blade. I'll fold it open, and I'm going to add a small bevel here. I'll run a bead of glue down the hinge and wipe away the excess with scrap. We'll let that cool, and then we're going to start adding some shape. When adding shape, I'm going to be working here forward on the upper wing skin. Now that I've got that done, I'm going to do the same thing on the outer upper wing skin. Now I've got shape added, let's do a quick test fit. When installing the upper wing skins, we want to make sure that the leading edges are lined up. So that looks good. Here at the back, we want to make sure that there is no gap between the upper wing skin and the fuselage. Now if you look up front, we have got a small gap. It's a little over 1/16 of an inch. We actually want to leave a gap whenever we glue the upper wing skin in place. The reason we want to do that is that once the wing skin is glued in place, we're going to reach up inside of the intake and we're going to push the intake out until it makes contact with this upper wing skin. By pushing the intake out and making contact with the upper wing skin, that's going to give us a really neat, iconic Coke bottle shape. To glue the upper wing skin in place, I'm going to be applying a very heavy bead of glue along the top of this spar up to this point. I'm also going to be applying a lot of glue here to this reinforcement, and I'm going to be applying glue along this spar. Let's go ahead and do that now. Make sure you have extra glue on standby. Start with my leading edge. Make sure that's lined up good. I'm going to press down, push it down in the back. I'm going to push this over towards the fuselage, and I'm going to apply gentle pressure for about 2.5 minutes. I'm checking over here. I want to make sure that I do have a gap, and that looks really good. Once that's had a chance to cool down, let's run a bead of glue from here all the way back. We'll let that cool. So I'm looking at my glue bead and everything looks good except for right here. Anytime you get a gap in the glue, always make sure the glue is fully cooled before adding a second pass. Also, it's always a good idea to wipe any excess glue off the tip. There we go. On this step, we're going to glue the leading edge of the wing. I'm going to run the tip of my glue gun between the upper and lower wing skin. Once I've applied glue, I'm going to apply tape and pull it tight. I'll pull down and wrap it. Once that's done, we just need to add our bead of glue where the intake meets the upper wing skin. For this next step, you can see that I've got my hand up inside the intake. I'm going to apply pressure, which is going to close that gap. I'm not going to worry about doing this all at once. It is very important that after you apply glue, that you give the glue plenty of time to cool down before moving on to the next section. I'm going to hold this for a full 3 minutes while the glue cools. My first pass of glue was very thin. I'm going to add a second thin line where the upper wing skin meets the intake. This is one of the harder steps in the kit, but this is one that will really help capture the iconic lines of the F4 Phantom. Once that's had a chance to cool down, I'm going to continue to work my way backwards. In this next step, we're going to be gluing the outermost upper wing skin into place, and it's going to fit about like that. Now, one thing that's going to really help is if I add a little bit of support right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a piece of scrap, add some shape, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue this up inside here. It's a little bit long, so I need to do some trimming first. To help me fit that part in there, I'm going to put a second piece of scrap, and then I'm going to just push this piece in. So what that's going to do is whenever I glue this in, this step is going to make it a lot easier to glue things in place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave that piece of scrap there temporarily, add a bead of glue here, lift up that wing skin, and slide this up underneath. We'll let that cool for just a minute. Then we're going to pull out that lower piece of scrap, and then we're going to go ahead and glue the wing skin in place. Now it's had a chance to cool down. Let's remove this lower piece of scrap. Double check that we know where we want to put this. That looks good. I'm going to run a bead of glue here, here, and here. I'm also going to run a bead of glue along the edge of this first upper wing skin. I'll drop this on. And I'm going to gently press down. This wing skin is slightly overlapping this wing skin. You can see that my upper wing skin is a little long. That's no problem. You can either trim it off or just push it down with your thumb. We do need to close this gap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip the assembly over and run a bead of glue where the upper wing skin meets the lower wing skin. You can also add a bead of glue here along the wingtip. Let's also add a bead of glue where the lower wing skin meets the underside of the fuselage. Once that cools down, repeat this same process on the other side. Once we get all the wires going in the same direction, I'm going to feed it through this window here on top of our battery box, and we're going to push these all out the front. You'll want to pull each wire individually to make sure you've got all the slack out of each of the wires. We discovered early on in our prototype testing that these EDFs tend to operate a lot more efficiently when this entire wad of wires isn't being sucked up inside. We actually lost one aircraft to the wires being sucked in, so it's really important that you secure these wires. What I've come up with is I'm going to take a barbecue skewer and I'm going to punch it through this former here at the back. Once I get a hole, I'm going to pull it out and I'm going to punch a hole going forward. Once I do that, I'm going to push the barbecue skewer backwards, and what this is going to do is this is going to give me something to zip tie all the wires to. I am going to add a little bit of glue where the barbecue skewer is going through the former. I'll do that at the back as well as the front. Once that's done, I'm going to gather up all my wires. I do want to make sure I've got all the slack out, and I'm going to zip tie it to this barbecue skewer. Once that's done, you can go ahead and trim away the excess zip tie. Make sure it doesn't end up inside this cavity. In fact, check this cavity for any loose foam, glue, or any debris. Anything that is in this cavity will be sucked through the EDFs. You don't want to damage them accidentally. Once you've got your wires secured, I'm going to apply a bead of glue here, and we're going to reinstall this section of spline that we cut away. Once that's cooled down, I'm also going to run a piece of this clear Gorilla Tape around the wires and run it around the spline. That'll give me a little bit of extra insurance. Here at the front, I'm also going to gather all the wires together. I've double checked, I've taken out all the slack, and I'm going to zip tie these together. Now that we've got all the wires secured, I'm going to drop in our last two stringers. I'm going to start by dropping this stringer into this notch and making a cut back here. Need to trim off a little bit of excess so this will fit. All right, my fit looks good. I'll drop a little glue in both these areas. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I want to make sure I don't accidentally make a mess with glue, so I'm going to run some tape right along the edge. Do the same on the other side. I'm going to run a small bead of glue between the stringer and the skin. Do that on both sides. I'm not using very much glue, but I just want enough to kind of keep it in place. Now that our stringers are glued in place, I want to double check that this is going to the F4 and this side is going towards the F5. I'm going to line up one side. And what I'm looking for, if you zoom around on this side, you're going to see that I've got a very slight overlap. It's a really, really good fit right there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to glue all the way across the bottom. Once I'm done, I'm going to bring this over and close it up. Before I add glue, I do want to double check that I have enough material. That's looking perfect. That looks really good. I'm going to check it here at the back as well. Yeah, we'll be able to work with that. That looks really good. Let's begin by adding a bead of glue all along this stringer. You can see I'm staying pretty high. The reason I'm staying high is when I put this piece in place, there's really not a lot of place for the glue to go. I've got my ruler handy. What I'm going to do, I'm going to press straight in. I want to make sure that this surface is flush with this surface and this surface is flush over here. I'm going to hold this in place for a full 2.5 minutes before moving on. This is a portion of the build you really want to take your time. When I close this over, I do notice that it's a little bit difficult to get it all the way closed. What'll help things out would be to add a bevel all the way across. Let's do that now. Let's try it one more time. What I'm checking for is to see if I've got any extra material sticking up. I have a little bit. I think I'll be able to smooth that out. It might be necessary to remove a slight amount of material. This one seems to be fitting really well. I think I'll be able to work with this just fine. Once I'm happy with my test fit, I'm going to run a bead of glue along the top of this former, along the spline, across this former, and along the top of this stringer. I might actually run a little bit right here on the edge of this skin, just a little. I think that might help us. So that's done. I'm going to pull this closed. Okay, it looks good here. You can see I've got a little bit of a gap here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my ruler. This is going to help me distribute pressure where I'm not going to create dents in the foam. And I'm going to hold this in place. You'll notice that I'm squeezing over here with my right hand as well, but if you look, I'm doing it right in line with the formers. Now that we've got this section glued in place, let's create a very small bevel right here. I'm barely taking off any material. Once that's done, we're going to close this up against the fuselage. You can see that my right hand is up against a former and my forearm is also against a former. So I'm pushing with the palm of my hand right here on this seam and bringing the two pieces together. To ensure my glue goes the same place, I want to have a line scored in the fuselage so I know just where to put the glue. In order to do that, I've got my battery box up here against my hip. I'm going to press the intake up to the fuselage. I'm going to take a razor blade and create a score. Once that's done, I'm going to run a piece of tape just above the score. Once that's done, I'm going to run a bead of glue right underneath my tape. And if I get on my tape, that's okay. I pull my tape away, the glue will be right where I need it to be. I'm going to hold this in place for a full 2.5 minutes while the glue cools. Again, you can see that my right hand is against former and my forearm is against the other former. Go ahead and hook up your elevators and your ailerons. If you need help with this, check out the servo video located in this playlist. A couple things that I want to point out. For the ailerons, run the shorter arm included with the servo. For the elevator servos, I am using the light landing gear wire. This is quite a bit heavier than the wire we're going to be using for the ailerons and the rudder. If you take a look at our pushrod housing, you can see that I've got it glued here at the back. I had an extra stringer. What I did was I cut a small section off. I'm going to glue it between the pushrod housing and the spline. This will help firm things up and make your elevator a little more responsive. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. Now that we've got our pushrod housing secured, I want to make sure that the spline is being glued together. I want to make sure it doesn't have a big gap. Next, we're going to locate 4 parts from our kit. They're unlabeled. They look like this. Starting with the smaller 2, I want to lay them on top of one another, and let's peel paper from the outside of each. Once that's done, we're going to add some shape. Now the white foam is going to be exposed on the final product, so we want to make sure that we don't have any glue on our table. Once that's done, we're going to be gluing this part right in here. We may have to make some minor tweaks to the shape of the part. If necessary, you can remove a little bit of foam. You can see I've got a little bit of a gap right here, so I'll probably take a little bit of foam off so that that'll snug up to this skin. We're first going to apply a bead of glue along this edge of the skin. I'm going to line it up here. If I take and gently press my horizontal stabilizer upwards, you can see that it closes that gap. Push it all the way back, make contact with the former, and I'm going to lift and hold. Hold this for a full 2.5 minutes while the glue cools down. On this next step, I'm going to be applying glue to the edge of this skin. I'm also going to be running a bead of glue on the paper right on the edge of the spline. We're going to go all the way up, and I'm also going to be dropping glue along this former here underneath the skin. You see that my glue is on the side of the spline and not on the top. Once that's done, starting here at the back, I'm going to push it down. You can see that this is flush. And in the front, I'm going to press it down with my thumb until it makes contact with the former. It's probably going to be a little bit taller than the spline, and that's okay. We're going to go and trim that after it's had a chance to cool down. Once that's done, we're going to do the same thing with the larger parts. You can see that I've got them laying right on top of one another. Go ahead and peel the outside paper on both pieces. Once that's done, you can go ahead and add some shape. And we'll do a quick test fit. So when I do my test fit, looks like I've got the wrong part. Since these parts are unmarked, it's going to be real easy to put the wrong part in place. So we want to test fit it first. I'm going to put this over here, and I'm going to go add shape to the other one. That one definitely fits better. It's a little bit tight right here, so we are going to remove a little bit of material. Just going to cut away a sliver. It's not too bad. I've got a little blob of glue here I'm going to need to remove. I'm also going to cut a bevel so this gap closes up a little bit better. These parts have been slightly oversized. There's a lot of pieces that come together, and so it's always going to be necessary to do a little bit of trimming to get these parts to fit correctly. I'm going to add a little bevel. There, that fits a lot better. So now that I'm happy with my fit, I'm going to add glue all the way around, and then we're going to reinstall the part. I'm going to add glue here on the side of the spline, add glue to my former, shoot a little glue down there on the former as best I can, and then I'm going to go over here to my skin. I'm going to add glue here, and then I'm going to add glue here. Carefully drop my part in. We'll give that about a minute and a half to cool down. Then we're going to do some trimming. Once the glue's had a chance to cool down, we're going to hold our razor blade flat against the edge of the spline, and we're going to remove all the excess material. Once this is done, go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. I noticed something when I did my test fit on the other side. When I dropped my part in, there's a bit of a step right here. That happened because I didn't do a really good job of mounting this in the slot where it was supposed to be. It's actually a little bit too low. It's no big deal. You can simply take a razor blade, and we're just going to remove a little bit of material so that that step is eliminated. Now you can see the edge is flush to the skin. Once you've done the other side, we need to add a strip right in here. Located in your kit is a piece shaped like this. You've got two scores down the middle. We're going to start by removing the foam from either side as indicated by the symbol mapping. I'm going to go down each of the scores up with the back side of my razor blade and break the foam away. Once that's done, we're going to wrap the paper around. I'm going to run a bead of glue on the edge and another light bead of glue here on the top. We'll roll it once, and then we'll roll it again. Then we'll do the same thing on the other side. Once that's done, let's take the side that has this double score. We're going to put it over the edge of the table, and we're going to put a gentle bend in it. We're not going to do a whole lot, just a little bit. Once that's done, we're going to take the side with the double score. It's going to go towards the back of the aircraft, and we're going to do a quick test fit. That looks good. I'm going to run a heavy bead of glue down the spline. In fact, I'm going to run 2 beads of glue. And I'm going to press these corners down to where it kind of matches this contour just a little bit better. One product I do find useful, especially over here on this, one product that I do find useful, especially on this exposed foam, is this foam putty. You can get it off Amazon, and you can use it as a filler anywhere you've got a gap. One thing that gets brought up quite a bit is when you go to paint exposed foam, I have a lot of people tell me that the foam dissolves. I can't say I've really had that problem, but what I generally do is I'll hit the foam with a very light dusting of primer. Then I'll hit it with another very light dusting of primer, and then I'll go ahead and paint it whatever color that I want. Generally, it's going to be a metallic color on this area. One other thing you can do is you can take something like that Aleene's Tacky glue or school glue or wood glue or something like that, and you can lightly smear it over the exposed foam and allow it to dry. Once it dries, you can go ahead and paint right over that dried glue. Once that's done, we're going to work on the vertical stabilizer assembly. Let's begin with the rudder. If you look at our rudder piece, you're going to see a reference mark here and a reference mark here. We're going to line our ruler up to those two reference marks, and we're going to peel the paper back to the ruler. Let's take and fold the paper back. We're going to flip it over, do the same thing on the other side. Once that's done, we're going to run the edge of our ruler right along that folded line, and holding my razor blade about 45 degrees to the table and then 45 degrees forward in the direction that we're drawing the blade, go ahead and cut your foam off. If you look at it from the side, you're going to see a nice angle all the way down. Now we're going to flip it over, line up our ruler the same way, and make that same cut. When we look at it now, it's going to kind of look like a knife edge. Once that's done, I'm going to run a thin bead of glue where the paper meets the foam. Once I get my glue added, I'm going to rotate it up about 45 degrees until the foam makes contact with the paper. Let that cool for a few seconds. I'm going to add a bead of glue right along the foam. Fold my paper down and then hold it at 45 degrees like I did on the first side. And then I'm going to shoot some glue between the two pieces of paper. That'll give us a tab right down the center of our rudder. Once that's done, let's go ahead and remove paper from the inside of our vertical stabilizer. Once we've removed the paper, let's run the back side of our razor blade down the score. I'm going to break it open and add a bevel where indicated. You can see I'm running a fairly steep bevel. Now that that's done, we need to add a little bit of shape. I only want to add shape to one half or the other. So you'll see that my hand is on this side of the score. Most of the shape is going to be added in this area right here. I'm not going to go clear up to the score. Once that's done, I'll do the same on the other side. Next, I'm going to fold this in half. And it's going to be very important that the edges are flush. You don't want to have a stair step. If you have a stair step, you're going to have to do quite a bit of trimming once you go to install the assembly. So it looks like I'm good and flush here. Up here at the front, it's a different story. Looks like I've got a pretty good stair step right there. What I might do is just remove a little bit of excess foam. We're probably going to have to do some trimming once we do our test fit, but I want to make it where I'm removing as little as possible. There we go. That looks good. Next, I'm going to run a bead of glue right here And I'm going to drop my rudder in place. On this next step, we're going to be adding glue. Make sure you only add glue to the areas indicated. I'm going to run a heavy bead of glue down the middle. I'm going to run a bead of glue about 3/4 of an inch from the edge all the way around. I'm going to run a stripe right here, and I'm going to put a little bit here at the back. I want to make sure and avoid adding glue to this area right here. Making sure that's lined up at the rear, and I'm looking straight down to make sure I don't have any stair stepping, or if I do, that it's very minimal. I'll hold this for about 1.5 minutes while the glue cools, then we're going to do a little bit of trimming. So you can see that my rudder is a little bit long. Using a straight edge, I'm going to trim off any excess. Once I've got my rudder trimmed, let's test fit the assembly onto the fuselage. Before we do our test fit, I want to put a center line up on this section of the fuselage. I'm going to line up a reference mark in the back and here in the front, and I want to go forward. Let's just put a mark between a little less than 2 inches all the way to 4 inches. Just a light score. It's going to be kind of hard to see that on the camera. I'll make it a little bit deeper. There we go. Once we've got our reference mark in the front, we're going to drop our assembly over this spline sticking up here in the back. I'm going to line up the center of the vertical stabilizer here in the front, and I'll center it here in the back. You can see that I've got about just a little less than a 1/2 inch here at the back between this seam and the back of our assembly. When doing my test fit, what I want to make sure is that when I push straight down, I don't have any excessive gaps. I've got a little bit of a gap here that's probably as big as it gets. I'm going to let that go. That'll be easy to fill with glue. If you have to do some trimming to make it fit, you can do that now. Once you're happy with your test fit, I'm going to run a bead of glue right along this spline. I'll do that on both sides. Push my assembly straight down. I'm going to hold downward pressure on this while the glue cools. I'm making sure that I don't have any excessive gaps front to back. I'm also checking to make sure as the glue is cooling that my whole assembly is centered. Once that's had a chance to cool down, let's run a bead of glue between the vertical stabilizer assembly and the fuselage. I'm going to hold that down while the glue cools, and we'll do the same thing on the other side. You can see I only went about 2/3 the way back. I find it's a little easier just to do part of it. Once the glue's cooled up front, you can run a bead of glue on the back half of the assembly. Once that's done, go ahead and hook up your servo to the rudder. Next, we're going to make the exhaust. Locate these two parts from your kit, and let's remove the paper from the side with the markings. We're going to add some shape. We'll do that on both parts. And we're going to bring our two edges together. Add a bead of glue. Push that glue to the inside and shingle over the side with glue. With the part that doesn't have glue, we'll hold this in place till the glue cools. You can always add a piece of tape to help hold it in place. Do the same thing on the other one. If you intend to paint your aircraft and install decals, I would not put these on until after you're done painting. But for demonstration, I am going to show you how these go on. This seam is actually going to be hidden down here at the bottom. So when I install this, I want to make sure that seam isn't visible from the outside of the aircraft. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pinch this exhaust unit until I've got an even amount of foam all the way around exposed. Looks good. Now normally I'm going to take and put a very, very heavy bead of glue all the way around. I'm only going to tack this in place because I am going to go and paint this aircraft as soon as we're done with this build video. So just pretend I'm adding a really heavy bead of glue all the way around. I'm going to press and hold this in place while the glue cools, and I'll do the same thing on the other side. Located in your kit are these two wooden parts. These are going to go right in front of the servo arms. This will help protect the servo arms when the aircraft lands. To install, we're simply going to push straight into the foam. You'll see that I've got them right in line with the servo arm. Do the same thing on the other side. Once that's done, we're going to flip the assembly over and go back to work on the battery box. Let's go ahead and add Velcro to the battery box. I'm going to put it up here at the front. You'll notice that it's slightly off center. It doesn't matter if it's off to the right or to the left. It's your choice. Once that's done, locate this long wooden piece included with your kit. You can see that my Velcro is off to the left. I'm going to put the wooden piece off to the right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drop it in about here, and we're going to hold it up against the side. I do want to make sure I don't have any wires between the wooden part and the side of the battery box. Once we've got our test fit, we're going to add a heavy bead of glue, and we're going to drop it back in place. I pushed it all the way back until it made contact with the spar. I've left between a 1/2 inch and a 3/4 inch gap between the wood and the front of the battery box. This ensures that my wooden reinforcement doesn't cover over my vents located towards the back of the battery box. Once the glue's had a chance to cool, go ahead and hook up your radio and add your Y power extension. Once all your electronics have been added, all you gotta do is slide your nose on, and your aircraft is done. This concludes our unique features section. There'll be another video covering additional accessories that you can add onto your aircraft.